We'll move on to our provision on AI model training and improvement restrictions. Matt, this is a very common provision. We're all used to this. It's basically you can't train with our model, at least in the first part. And then it's got this exception in the second part. What is the model training and what is improvement restrictions?
Sure. Yeah, absolutely. So when you submit a prompt or an input or output, a vendor wants to use that information to improve its system, try to improve the model for not just for you, but for other users. So think of data training as teaching the AI model, giving it context, helping it understand the way the words are connected in a sentence, et cetera, to get it to operate, but also to make it better in the future. And so the risk there is that with some models, public LLMs in particular, and depending on what your contract says, your data could be used to inputs and your outputs and other related data could be used by the vendor to enhance this model, but also may end up in outputs seen by external parties, third parties, competitors, the public, et cetera. So generally speaking, that is the risk.
Can you explain generally what's the problem with the structure that we've got here?
Yeah, I can point out a few things. I think training, right? Training, what does that really mean? It's not a defined term and it can have multiple facets to it, different aspects, training, retraining, fine tuning. Doesn't really spell out in a meaningful way how the data can be used by the vendor or not used by the vendor. You don't want to have some walk into it because training might have a technical definition or other meaning that's not necessarily captured here. I don't like that it's only its artificial intelligence or machine learning model. I think it should be any artificial intelligence or ML model, including third parties. So the vendor may use aggregated, anonymized data derived from the customer's use of the services. That's a little funky, right? AI is very good at rebuilding aggregated and anonymized data. As having that without any kind of standard or definition behind it runs the risk of the company, the vendor, taking information derived from the user, customer data, customer's use of the services to build profiles about the customer, to build profiles about users.
The anonymized and aggregated data concepts in here. Can you share just at a high level for people who aren't as familiar with those concepts, what that is and where the problems are generally with that?
Sure. So those are concepts from the privacy sphere to not be able to identify individuals based on some kind of PII, whether it's a full name or PII in conjunction with other data that can help identify somebody, because companies have privacy obligations. And so that's what aggregating and anonymizing data is. You mentioned de-identification. I believe that's another concept to respect the privacy rights of individuals. Regulated companies that have agreements with customers and users have very strict privacy obligations. They just want to make sure they are in compliance with those.
Yeah. Okay. No, perfect. And I think that's a great setting the stage for all the issues that exist with this language. And I'll turn to you, Kate, from the vendor perspective. Looking at this as a vendor, what are the biggest concerns with the different types of language?
Yes. So this is a real bugbear for me. If you get nothing else for me, just anonymized. Using the term anonymized in an undefined way is going to be a huge risk on both sides. If we're looking at it from the vendor side in particular, it doesn't have a clear legal definition across jurisdictions. And in some jurisdictions, like under GDPR, there's actually an understanding that it means cannot be re-identified, right? And in an AI world, all of the theoretical threats around re-identification that used to be like, technically somebody could take 75 years and re-identify all the, it's going to take 15 minutes, right? So it is incredibly important to pick a definition of de-identification and reference it specifically in the agreement. There are different definitions you can use, like NIST has a great one. If you're dealing with health data, we got HIPAA. You can really look at specific techniques you want to use, like differential privacy or hashing. I think the important thing is to be really specific and be aware of how sensitive the data is and what is appropriate to that data. If it's a lot of customer data that contains sensitive consumer data, you want to have a much higher bar for re-identification than if you've got maybe some employee email addresses or something. I think another thing that I see in this one that just punches my alert button It's again, Matt mentioned this, training. Training is a big tent. We've got fine tuning. We've got like different kinds of definition there. So I think the important thing is to actually, rather than using the buzzword of train, make sure that you're on the vendor side. You know how the product actually works. Describe what you're doing.
Yeah.
Is this going to be like a RAG operating on top of a third party, but not allowing that data to go back to the underlying model? Are there going to be multiple models coming in here? You need to be specific and thoughtful about how the product actually works. And a lot of these companies, like very few companies have their own models. Most are going to be tagging into another service like Anthropic or like one of these even big companies, Bedrock,
Yeah.
US, those are going to be able to swap out over time. How are you going to define what is being trained? Is it the layer on top? Is it the underlying model? Do you have clear rights over that? And I think understanding how your own product works before you go into the negotiation is, again, paramount.
Yeah. And so looking at those kinds of issues you were just talking about, kind of the understanding training, the definition of what that really means, because this is a small T training. I know we need to understand the product. Are there things you would change about this provision? Let's say you are the vendor and you see this in the form. Are there things that beyond just making sure it's customized for your product that are particularly like what would you cross out, or what would you ask for concessions on, or are there
Yeah.
anything like that?
Yes. Shall not use customer data to train its artificial intelligence or machine learning models. What is its artificial intelligence? I would probably come back and say we need to separate the third-party AI models from the vendor's own technology and differentiate the restrictions on those two layers.
So in a sense, you'd break this up with extra sentences or subparts, and artificial intelligence or machine learning models figure out what the vendor's technology is, like third-party IP versus the product IP and things like that. At least
Yeah.
traditionally, that's how we thought of it.
Define those separately so that you can treat them separately, because you probably want your vendor's product to improve
Yeah.
once you feel like you have a good standard of anonymization, the identification,
Yeah.
but you probably don't want to be like enhancing ChatGPT with your own data.
Yeah, no, that's great. The subject today is an auditing and reviewing. When you are drafting this, are you thinking about those kinds of concepts of how are we going to verify any of this? You're on the vendor side. How are you thinking about being able to document this for your customers as a vendor, and what kinds of things you can do there?
Absolutely. So I think this is where we get back to having actual definitions of different elements of the data and the service and the different activities you're doing. If you're making broad claims about not using data outside of the services, or if you're making broad claims about aggregated and anonymized data, it's going to be nearly impossible to demonstrate if you do have an audit that you have anonymized data, because if somebody digs hard enough, they will find a way to retrieve some of that data. Those definitions need to be tight or you can get into real trouble.
Yeah. And I want to ask just that last phrase too. I'm wondering what the approach is for use of the services to improve vendors' models and algorithms. You talked about trying to separate out the vendor's layer of technology from the LLMs, and I assume that would play into that part as well, and you'd need to do something there. So would you use the same concepts and carry them through down here when you're revising, or would you just address this whole issue of what that can be used for in a separate way? Just curious of your practice of drafting.
So I think in general, there's a combination of defining this, like including this in the definitions, breaking apart what the different layers of technology are, and then referencing them specifically. And that can vary so much between companies. One thing that I find really useful, and I know this is a contract discussion, and I am the product attorney, but one thing I have done that works over and over is to bring in like a good product or engineering person on either side so that they can verbally go through. Because if you're just passing paper between lawyers, it is, I think, nearly impossible to have the trust and understanding necessary for these definitions to be meaningful, because there's like a depth of technical understanding where if you don't do it full time, it's really hard to get. You can have trusting relationship with your product or engineering person, and their lawyer has a trusting relationship with their product and engineering person. You can get them to do some of the discussion and some of the issue spotting, like pressure testing, and then come back and define those layers more cleanly.
I like that. I like that. So it's a real kind of process of you're looking at this language. You're like, what the heck does this mean of improved vendors, models, and algorithms? You go take that and go back to your team. And it sounds like almost like iterating a process or iterating information or a draft, except this time we're going to be needing to do a lot of iterating unless you're already that technical expert and you know your product so well, but you might not know how this customer's using it. So really good information. I can see a lot of people in the chat are agree. Yes, yes, completely agree. So let's move to you, Matt, on the customer side. And you talked a little bit already about some of the changes that you would make. What, just specifically from the lens of a customer, what is the kinds of things that you're thinking about when you read this kind of language? Like, you're like, yay, this is perfect, I'll take it. Or is it, no, this is terrible, I need to change everything?
Probably more the latter. I mean, just like my IP spidey sense is tingling when I see derived from,
Oh, that's a good one. That's a good one.
because that to me just means insights, patience, or analyses that you really are paying for, right? Because if you are a definition of output, sometimes my recommendation is that it should include derived information. You don't want to walk into an exception to that here necessarily. I always ask the vendor, why do you need, what aggregated anonymized data are you looking to use, and how is that going to improve the services? I think having that conversation, as Kay was pointing out internally, externally too, helping us form it, because really, I really want to understand the purpose of what they're doing here with the data.
Can I ask you though, on the derived thing, could you explain that? Just maybe some people aren't as familiar with the derived and the connotations and problems that you get once you start talking about derived anything.
Sure. Like from an IP perspective, and I'm not going to get into like derivative works.
Yeah.
I was thinking more along the lines of just non-public proprietary information and trade secrets. So to say you're using an AI tool, a note taker, for instance, right? And your R&D team is having a meeting, and the tool prints out not just a transcript, but identifies analyses, insights, information derived from a conversation, right? Hey, had you thought about taking X and Y and making it into Z, or modifying the process, or whatever it is? And I always view information derived from IP that meets the criteria of a trade secret to be a trade secret as well. So derived from gives me a little bit of anxiety when I see it there, because you don't want to give away aggregated and anonymized information derived from your IP to somebody else to use for their services, train, which may mean ending up in somebody else's output.
Yeah, no, and I think that's I'm glad you zoned in on that word, because we see it a lot, and it's like so many words in these provisions. We kind of, sure, conceptually, if you're reading fast, that seems fine. But then when you try and drill down, is there an alternative that you like to replace derived with? What's more precise that doesn't get into that issue? I don't know if there's a standard alternative or a standard way you would revise that concept to make it more specific on the derived issue.
You start walking down the road of what it's generated from. Is that any different? When I'm looking at this, and I think of it from a privacy context too, because that's what I see when I think of aggregation and anonymized data, I would really just want to push back and understand it, because AI models don't just learn from the data you submit, but they learn from patterns of data as well.
Such a good point. Yeah.
You're really going to understand the data they're collecting to understand what this means and how they're going to use it. And then another thing here to improve. Prove and train, there's overlap in those concepts, but they're not necessarily have the same. Like improve is broader.
Yeah.
Than train. And so they're not apples to apples necessarily. So those are some of the things that jumped out at me. And like something like this, I think there are ways to work with this and exceptions to the exceptions, right? About not being able to. So accepted vendor may use aggregated or anonymized data to do X, Y, and Z. However, they can't use it to identify customers, users, things like that. To give yourselves extra protection on the back end if the vendor is dead set on keeping the language similar to this or the same provision.
No, that's great. That's great. And I think it makes a lot of sense and really highlights when you get this AI slop provision inbound for you to review and you see this and just how problematic it is at so many different levels. What's the problem with a lot of AI generated stuff? It's written in a way that makes it seem fine because it's consistent with patterns and uses words that we see. But when you use them in this combination, it's creating some issues.